The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
And the saint we're going to begin discussing is Juan Diego. In some of our programs, we talked about how certain cults have evolved in the lives of certain saints. Well, certainly this could be the case for Saint Juan Diego.
Absolutely. And I think for some of our viewers, we have to immediately say Our Lady of Guadalupe for them to maybe remember who Juan Diego is. Juan Diego was gifted with the apparitions of Our Lady around the town of Guadalupe, and there were several apparitions, as there usually are. I think sometimes people think it's a one-shot deal. With Bernadette Subaru near Lourdes, there were several apparitions, and there were several with the children of Fatima. And so certainly we see that in each of those events, through Mary, these cults develop. And the cult around Juan Diego was one because of this message that Our Lady was offering him.
What's interesting, too, and we had talked about it briefly before the taping of the show, is that oftentimes apparitions from Our Lady are geared towards young children. This is a case where Juan Diego was in his 50s. He was on his way to Mass. It was said that he would travel 12, 15 miles every day to walk to go to Mass. And it was at that time that he encountered Our Lady. And yet he did it in the middle of his life. And so what do you think that is telling us in the midlife of our own existence?
Well, I certainly think that it is challenging all of us to recognize that we need to be open at every stage of our lives. If we go back to Fatima or Lourdes or even images of saints or the Blessed Mother appearing to other saints or other people throughout history like Joan of Arc, they're young. And so we might say, well, we need to teach the young. And then that can evolve into that. Well, I went to a Catholic school, or I went to a Catholic high school, or I went to CCD or PSR, whatever it is. And by the time I was confirmed or the time I graduated, I learned everything. And we can close ourselves off from learning more. Not just more about facts about the church, but more about who we are in relationship with God. Juan Diego challenges us to see that we need to be open at every stage of our lives to welcome these voices in that will challenge us as we continue the journey of life.
When obviously his cult has grown exponentially, that over 20 million people, 22 million people a year visit the actual shrine in Guadalupe, that has to say something about the message, not only from the Blessed Mother, but also within the life and ministry and mission of Juan Diego himself, and how he shared that message with the hierarchy at the time, who oftentimes may not have been open to hearing this or understanding that there are these apparitions that happen. And so there were signs that occurred through Mary for him to share with those so that others could believe. And how oftentimes, in the Gospels, we talk about how people look for signs, and Jesus was one who performed signs. And they were performed specifically so people will come to believe. And isn't that really the life of the saint? That through that existence, through that mission and ministry, that one comes to believe. And that's really the call of evangelization as well. So Juan Diego, at this time in his life, in the mid of his life, was called to be an evangelizer, was through these apparitions to share the joy and the presence of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Absolutely, and I think the lasting power of so many people continuing to be devoted. And again, it links with Lourdes or with Fatima. As you said, there would have been great skepticism and maybe even some cynicism, not only on civil leaders, but in each of these cases in church hierarchy, a great deal of scrutinizing the event, which I think should be there to make sure that this is legitimate. But in discerning each of these apparitions, whether it's Guadalupe or the others, what is discerned is not just that it's true or that it happened, but that there is a sincerity and a purity in receiving the message and then seeking to convey the message. And I think that is, people can see that. And I think that is why the cult or the following around Juan Diego and around Our Lady of Guadalupe is so strong, because people can sense in that series of events and the ultimate messages that Juan Diego brings forth, that sincerity, that purity of how we are called to continue in a journey of faith.
And even in the words of the Holy Father at the canonization itself, he mentioned Juan Diego as someone who, in this new world, brought others to Christ. So he was really, in a pure sense of the word, an evangelizer. And of course, there were certain signs, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention during the fourth apparition, there were the roses that appeared. Absolutely. And these are roses that grew in frozen soil that were just beautiful to behold. And then, of course, the Our Lady itself, when we see the picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe, we notice the imprints and the names and so forth. And so there's that visual sign that draws people. You know, how wonderful it would be if we didn't need signs to respond to God's call. But as human beings, we're always looking for that. We're always needing that in our own life. Also, we have a few minutes left. His feast day is on December 9th. And so it's significant that it's very close to the Immaculate Conception.
Absolutely. And in a previous episode, we've spoke about the connection between Maximilian Mary Kolbe's feast day and the Assumption and his great devotion to Mary. And so certainly the Assumption, Mary being taken up into heaven, is one aspect of her life. The Immaculate Conception really is at the very beginning. Those two feasts kind of bookend. Mary being immaculately conceived, the beginning of her life and the beginning of her being prepared to be the vessel of Christ. And then because she remained pure in her relationship with Christ throughout her life, she is given the gift of being assumed body and soul into heaven. For Juan Diego, he reminds us of that purity of bringing forth the message of Christ, that message that was only possible by being brought forth from Mary.
We're going to talk about another unique saint who certainly was an evangelizer in his own right, but we're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. There is a place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. A place where people from 7 states away will turn up at your door and give you food and shelter after a flood. There's a place where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will stretch out their hand and put it across your shoulders and say, "Everything is going to be okay." That place is called America, where we look out for each other, and it's up to us to keep it that way. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 Hello and welcome back. We're going to talk now about Saint Peter Claver. Of course, we know that he was a Jesuit. He was born in Spain and died in Cartagena, Colombia. But his life is rather unique because he had his ministry primarily among the African slaves. Let's talk a little bit about historically his life.
Well, as you said, a Jesuit, which the hallmark of the Jesuit order certainly would have been one of gaining knowledge and sharing knowledge of Christ and the church with others. But we see in Peter Claver that knowledge, as we've spoken before, that knowledge has to reside in and pour forth from the heart. And so he sees his call in the church, as many saints have, but in a very concrete, and as we'll soon hear, in a very vast way. He sees his calling to serve those who are thought the least among us. And at his time, in the 1800s, what population in certain countries would be the least among us but the population of slaves?
Well, it's interesting because slavery really permeates the history of humanity. It goes back, obviously, way before in the Roman time, the Roman Empire. Slaves were as numerous as the people themselves. And so there's this whole sense of bondage that has been part of the people, going back to the Hebrews in the promise, before they went to the promised land. There's that whole sense that people oftentimes are slaves in a literal sense because of bondage, because of some country. But we talked at another point in the life of another saint where sometimes we can have this bondage to our spiritual life as well. And so I would imagine in the life of Peter Claver that he served a dual purpose. He tried to work for the abolition of slavery, but also to bring the slaves from a bondage spiritually to new life in Christ, and a burgeoning of their own faith within them. And of course we know that whole sense of work among the Africans and the slaves was a rather difficult work for St. Peter, but it was one that he did joyfully, and he did constantly till the day of his death.
And as you point out, with different populations of slaves throughout history, we can also see a connection with their spirituality. Obviously, the Hebrews cling to their spirituality, they cling to their God. We see in our own country the very important role that spirituality plays for the African American slave. We have spirituals and the singing, and it was a time for them to see their self-worth in this relationship. And I think that's at the heart of perhaps Peter Claver and others who have been missionaries directly to slave populations, because discovering a relationship with God and discovering that we are brothers and sisters in the Lord restores that sense of dignity and that sense of equality that was lacking in every other aspect of their life, and allowing a slave population especially to come to know Christianity. How can you be a slave owner and your slave shares the same spirituality as you, which calls us all to the equality and the dignity of Christ's life? It not only would have been perhaps a great gift, as we know it was, to the slaves, but a great challenge to those who were enslaving them.
It's interesting, when we were talking about that, we may want to have the folks that are with us at some point read the biblical book from St. Paul, his letter to Philemon, because that letter specifically talks about St. Paul and his relationship to Onesimus, who was a slave, who they become, whether they met in prison, we don't really know, but came to understand him not as a slave, but as a brother in the Lord. And so there's that whole sense that we are called through our own life in Christ to bring others out of this bondage and to unite others to the free family of God. And so I would encourage them to read Philemon. The other thing that's interesting in the life of Peter Claver is that it was said that he baptized personally over 300,000 slaves in Colombia. His ministry in Colombia lasted 40 years, and so within that length of time, that was an unprecedented number. I'm looking at my ministry. I've been ordained 36 some years. I know I have not baptized 300,000 babies, but it's almost mind-boggling to see the scope of this man in his ministry. And what you think that is telling us nowadays about baptism and conversion and the call of the gospel?
Well, certainly when we see that vast number, it is impressive. To put it into perspective, there are about 200,000 baptized Catholics in the Diocese of Youngstown. He baptizes 300,000 personally. But it is a reminder that baptism, again, is what frees us. And I think we tend to not understand that. Parents preparing to have their child baptized might only see obligation. You know, I have to go to a baptism prep class. We have to do this, we have to do that. And they see obligation put upon them. Baptism is exactly what it was for those slaves, what it is for us. It is that freeing. It frees us from original sin, but it frees us then to follow the Lord more faithfully each and every day. And I think that's so true if we want to use that play on slavery and freedom through Scripture, through teachings of the church, through society. Oftentimes that in which we see ourselves being enslaved really is to free us.
We would be remiss if we did not mention the wonderful Society of the St. Peter Claver, one of the largest, if not the largest, African-American fraternal organization in the world, named after their patron, Peter Claver. I know that I've had experience with ladies and knights in the St. Peter Claver Society. They're all around the world, and so we would encourage those African American Catholics who are not part of that organization to inquire about it and perhaps to join their ranks, because they do lots of wonderful fraternal work among African Americans within their own polity and their own communities as well. Any closing words before we take a break?
I think, again, dovetailing with that, I think it is important. And I know sometimes we tap dance around allowing people to grow in segments of population. I think it is important that people can seek out what feeds them. And certainly the Peter Claver Society, many schools for African American Catholics have been named for Peter Claver. I think the beauty in that is that it allows us to take the framework of our Catholic faith, but then to grow in other commonalities. We know the church in this country grew largely from different European congregations, whether it was a German or a Polish or an Italian. And I think we see a resurgence now with Hispanics growing in the country. And certainly there is this untapped knowledge of the African American Catholic experience. And I think that's a story that still is being written and needs to be told.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Light Moments. Here's Father Tom McSweeney.
Parenting requires the wisdom of Solomon and the patience of Job. And here's a few commandments that can make this difficult job a little easier. The first is, thou shalt never damage thy children's self-esteem. A healthy self-image is essential to a child's physical and spiritual growth. Second, be neither under-involved or over-involved in thy children's lives. Strike a solid balance between holding on to your children and letting them go. Third, thou shalt listen to thy children. If you allow your children to express their feelings, they'll return the favor and listen to yours. Finally, thou shalt not preach a double standard. What is not acceptable for your children is not acceptable for you either.
This message from the Christophers, New York, New York 10017.
Welcome back to Communion of Saints. Now we're going to talk about St. John Neumann. As a matter of fact, I was mentioning to Father Lavelle before the taping that I actually was at his canonization in June 19th of 1977 in Vatican City. Outside it was a beautiful day. It was probably the last canonization ceremony that Pope Paul VI had celebrated. And so it was a rather moving celebration. There were people there from his hometown. There were lots of people there from Philadelphia, where he was bishop. And so there's that was that whole sense of this is the first American bishop to be canonized, and how significant that is for the church in North America.
Absolutely, and we see in John, first to date, he is still the only male citizen of the United States to be canonized. The women are outranking him by several now. But it also would have been a great celebration for the church in the United States. That one of our own, not born here, but who has come here and ministered to the church, is now given as an example to the people of the New World. That it is possible to become a saint, it is possible to be holy and devout and faithful. And I think you were sharing a story about how he even got here to begin with.
What's interesting is he was born in Prague in Bohemia, and he really wanted to be a priest. He studied for it. When it came time for his ordination, the bishop told him that he could not ordain him because they had too many priests.
Imagine that today.
And so what the bishop suggested is that he write to a bishop in the United States to see if he might transfer. And the bishop would have given his approval to do that. So he wrote the Bishop of New York. The bishop accepted him. He was actually ordained for the Archdiocese of New York, and then joined the Redemptorist community, and so served in that capacity. But then he was appointed the Archbishop of Philadelphia, and that's where his ministry and his life really burgeoned there. He began schools. He's really the founder of the Catholic school system in the United States. He also was called by many dioceses around the country to give parish missions as well. Recall in the Diocese of Youngstown, he was asked to come to St. Joseph Church in Mogador. There was some strife there among the Germans that had settled. And so being of that somewhat extraction, he went there for an actual retreat and brought some unity among that group of Germans. And perhaps that was what made him a saint. And so there's that whole sense of he exercised his ministry above and beyond what he probably imagined and even expected in his own life.
And I think when you point out his role in Catholic education, and I think we're very blessed in our country, there's kind of a female counterpart for him, that they kind of collaborate, if you will, and that's Elizabeth Ann Seton, who we know did a great deal of work with Catholic education, who is canonized around the same time, the mid-70s. And also their feast days are just one day apart. And we see that when we come back from Christmas vacation in our schools, there's a lot of focus on our Catholic education. We move into Catholic Schools Week later in the month. But I know a lot of schools, when they come back after that Christmas break and they have Mass coming back together, they do it around the feast of either Elizabeth Ann Seton or John Neumann to dedicate themselves to learning more, not just the disciplines of the subjects in school, but really about their faith. And I think that knowledge of our faith, that knowing the scriptures and knowing the life of Christ is what then enables us to go out and do our ministry, and to a great extent enabled the bishop, the archbishop, to be able to go out and bring peace and unity to the Catholic population.
I mentioned that he was canonized by Blessed Paul VI in 1977, but he was also beatified by him in 1963. So it's really the beginning of Paul VI's pontificate, but also in the midst of Vatican II as well. So there's this significance for the Pope amidst the council to name those that he was calling to sainthood. And so there's that almost bookend in the life of Paul, but also in the history and life of the church, and also in the school system in the life of the church, how important that is. What other facet of John Neumann do you think would be appropriate for us to share with the folks that are with us? He certainly was someone who worked tirelessly, and yet he died at a very young age, at the age of 48. And so in this small period of time, he did so much.
Well, I think going back to the beginning of his vocation story, wanting to be a priest and being told, I can't take you. I don't have a job for you. And so many people might have just said, okay, well, I'll find something else to do with my life. How often we allow that rejection to dictate the decisions of our life. And so even if it's not a vocation to the priesthood or religious life, if we truly feel called to a particular vocation, to continue to do everything in our power to see that through. I imagine what it must have been to leave. Now again, we have to get out of our 21st century mindset of everybody wants to come to the United States. This is, the 1830s. He had a very good life and his family in Prague, and to come to what is really mission territory. It might be New York City and it might have been Philadelphia, but it's still, the Catholic Church is still kind of a missionary project. But his faith and his desire to be a priest superseded all of it.
Another thing that we might want to mention in closing is that in this day and age where we experience in the Catholic Church many school closures, very painful times in the lives not only of parishes but in the lives of parents and students, that perhaps during that time they could pray to St. John Neumann to intercede as someone who began the great school system, the Catholic school system in the United States, as a source of comfort and consolation, because these are changing times, these are difficult times. And so we invite the folks that are with us to turn to him intercessorily. Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
$33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.